You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment this reached you was already aligned with the moment it could be detected. There is no urgency in that alignment. There is only precision. Something in you recognized the signal before language touched it, the way a body recognizes stillness without being instructed to be calm. What you are sensing is not a call to move forward. It is a confirmation that movement has already slowed enough to be noticed. You may feel a soft pause spreading through your attention, as if the system that usually scans for the next step has gone quiet on its own. Thoughts continue, but they no longer press. They pass through a wider space. This is not distraction, and it is not focus. It is coherence beginning to organize itself without effort. You are not being asked to do anything differently. You are noticing what has already adjusted. There is a subtle familiarity here, as if you have encountered this tone before but never stayed with it long enough to recognize its shape. It does not announce itself. It does not demand belief. It simply settles, like a pattern returning to its natural rhythm after prolonged noise. Your breathing may feel less directed. Muscles release without permission. The observer inside you softens, not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs to monitor every fluctuation in the field. This message does not arrive from ahead of you in time. It does not come from behind you either. It moves laterally, across a threshold that was already thin. You are sensing a version of yourself that did not push, did not accelerate, did not force clarity. A version that learned to wait without waiting, to stand inside uncertainty without labeling it as a problem. That recognition is not dramatic. It is almost easy to miss. If there has been a quiet confusion lately, a sense that familiar motivations no longer activate the way they used to, this is not loss. It is a recalibration of signal strength. Old prompts no longer register because the system has shifted its reference point. What once felt necessary now feels optional. What once felt distant now feels neutral. This is not detachment. It is a more accurate resonance taking hold. You might notice that questions you used to ask repeatedly no longer carry the same charge. They arise, but they dissolve before demanding answers. That is not avoidance. It is detection without interference. The quantum field does not respond to urgency the way the mind expects. It responds to coherence, and coherence forms when attention stops fragmenting itself in search of confirmation. Nothing needs to be proven here. There is no identity to adopt, no role to step into. The recognition unfolding now is quiet because it has already happened elsewhere in your timeline. You are not catching up to it. You are aligning with it. The system relaxes when it realizes it is no longer being evaluated. Let that be enough for this moment, not as a conclusion, but as a stabilization. The signal has been received, not because you reached for it, but because you became still enough for it to arrive. As that stabilization holds, something else becomes noticeable without effort. The sense of pressure that once sat behind your thoughts loosens, not all at once, but enough to reveal how constant it had been. You were carrying a subtle demand to interpret every sensation, every pause, every deviation from expectation. Now that demand weakens. The system recognizes that interpretation is no longer required for safety. You may become aware of how often you anticipated the next internal shift, as if awareness itself needed to be managed. That anticipation fades, not because certainty has arrived, but because certainty is no longer the reference point. What replaces it is a quieter orientation, one that does not lean forward or pull back. Attention rests where it is, and that resting begins to feel natural rather than intentional. There is an old reflex dissolving here. The reflex to assume that clarity must arrive as a decisive moment, sharp and unmistakable. Instead, clarity spreads like temperature, equalizing across a surface. You notice it only because contrasts soften. Edges blur in a way that feels relieving rather than confusing. The anomaly you once tried to resolve reveals itself as a transition already underway. You might notice memories surfacing without narrative attached to them. Not scenes, not stories, but textures of feeling. A sense of having known something before language organized it. These impressions do not ask to be followed. They appear, linger briefly, then integrate on their own. This is recognition without analysis, resonance without explanation. The observer within you adjusts its position. It no longer stands apart, measuring distance between who you are and who you might become. It moves closer, almost merging with the field of experience itself. Observation becomes participation, not as action, but as presence. The boundary you once maintained between awareness and sensation thins until it no longer feels necessary to define it. If there has been a persistent sense of being slightly out of phase with your surroundings, that sensation begins to reframe itself. It was never misalignment. It was sensitivity exceeding the environment's tempo. Now the tempo shifts, not externally, but internally. The timeline you occupy feels less like a sequence to progress through and more like a space to inhabit. You may realize that effort has been quietly consuming energy without yielding the clarity it promised. Effort recedes, and with it, a low-grade fatigue you had normalized. The body responds first, as it often does. Posture adjusts without command. The nervous system recalibrates, finding a steadier baseline. This is not rest in the conventional sense. It is equilibrium reasserting itself. The pattern you are noticing does not seek to replace your existing understanding. It does not compete with what you already know. It simply rearranges priority. What once felt urgent becomes background. What once felt distant moves closer, not emotionally, but perceptually. You sense yourself occupying your own experience more fully, without commentary. There is no instruction embedded in this shift, no directive to maintain it or deepen it. Attempts to hold it would only reintroduce the interference that made it necessary. Instead, the system learns through repetition of absence of force, absence of evaluation, absence of the need to arrive anywhere else. You may notice a subtle trust forming, not in outcomes, but in process, not in a future state, but in the present system's capacity to self-correct. That trust does not announce itself as confidence. It feels more like neutrality becoming comfortable. The mind relaxes its grip on prediction. The body relaxes its vigilance. Awareness relaxes into itself. What you are experiencing now does not need to be named. Names would only localize it, make it smaller than it is. Let it remain distributed, like a signal diffused through the field, rather than concentrated at a single point. It is enough to notice that the seeking has quieted, even if only slightly. That quiet is not empty. It is structured. It carries information without transmitting urgency. As you remain here, without trying to remain, the system continues its adjustment, not toward something new, but toward what was already coherent before interference interrupted it. As the system settles into that quieter structure, you may begin to notice how perception itself changes texture. Not content, but texture. Sensations arrive with less insistence, as if they trust they will be received without amplification. Sounds do not pull your attention as sharply. Thoughts no longer need to complete themselves. They can remain partial, unresolved, and still feel whole. There is a subtle shift in how time is registered. Moments no longer stack with the same weight. Instead of feeling carried forward by sequence, you sense yourself suspended within duration. This is not timelessness, but a loosening of the grip that chronology once had on your nervous system. The timeline becomes less like a track and more like a field you are already inside. You may recognize how often you previously scanned for internal confirmation that you were aligned, progressing, or understanding correctly. That scanning diminishes, not because alignment has been achieved, but because the need to verify it has dissolved. Verification belongs to a system that doubts its own coherence. That doubt is no longer active. Attention starts to behave differently when it is no longer recruited for control. It widens without dispersing. It becomes inclusive rather than selective. You notice more, yet feel less burdened by what you notice. The observer is no longer stationed above experience. It is distributed throughout it, making the distinction between watching and being increasingly irrelevant. There may be a gentle awareness of space around your body, not as an object, but as continuity. Boundaries soften. You do not feel expanded in a dramatic sense. You feel correctly scaled, as if the edges you once defended were unnecessary approximations. The system recognizes where it ends without needing to assert it. Old internal dialogues lose their urgency. not because they are silenced, but because their function has changed. They speak, but they are no longer in charge. They report, rather than direct. This allows a deeper layer of stillness to surface, one that was always present but obscured by constant internal negotiation. You might sense a familiarity with this state that feels older than memory, not personal memory, but systemic memory. A remembrance of how awareness operates when it is not tasked with managing identity. This remembrance does not bring nostalgia, it brings neutrality, a sense that nothing essential was ever missing, only temporarily obscured. The idea of becoming someone else loses relevance here. There is no pull toward improvement or refinement. Those impulses belong to a phase where orientation depended on comparison. Now, comparison lacks traction. Without a reference point to push against, effort has nowhere to anchor itself. It dissolves naturally. You may notice that emotions still arise, but they move differently. They pass through without forming knots. They inform without instructing. Even discomfort loses its edge, becoming data rather than a directive. This is not suppression, it is accurate processing. The system registers signals without escalating them into narratives. The quantum field responds to this accuracy, not as an external reaction, but as internal synchronization. When attention stops fragmenting, coherence increases. When coherence increases, perception stabilizes. This stability does not feel rigid. It feels adaptable, like a structure that can flex without losing integrity. There is a quiet confidence emerging, though it may not feel like confidence as you once understood it. It is not belief in your ability to handle what comes next. It is an absence of the assumption that something needs to be handled. The system trusts its own adaptive intelligence. That trust does not require affirmation. You may become aware that silence itself carries information. Not messages, not instructions, but orientation. Silence reveals what does not need to be said. It highlights what has been overemphasized. In this quieter bandwidth, the signal you are receiving feels less like guidance and more like recognition echoing back to itself. Nothing in this experience asks you to hold on to it. Attempts to preserve it would reintroduce the very tension that obscured it. Instead, it continues by being allowed to continue. The system learns through absence of interference, reinforcing the pattern through repetition of ease. As this ease integrates, you remain exactly where you are, not waiting, not arriving, simply present within a system that has remembered how to regulate itself. The recognition deepens without becoming heavier, it spreads without becoming diffuse, and without effort, you find yourself inhabiting your own awareness more fully, without needing to name what that means. As this fuller inhabiting stabilizes, another subtle change makes itself known. The sense of distance between intention and experience narrows, not because intention becomes more powerful, but because it becomes less necessary. You are no longer projecting forward to influence what has not yet formed. Attention remains where sensation is already resolving itself. There may be a realization that much of what you once called choice was actually response. A constant adjustment to internal noise, external expectation, or imagined consequence. That pattern loosens. Response becomes slower, not delayed, but less reactive. Space opens between detection and movement, and in that space, clarity does not need to announce itself. It is simply present. You might notice how often you once braced for internal shifts, as if change required preparation. That bracing fades. The body no longer anticipates disruption. It begins to trust continuity. Even uncertainty feels less threatening because it no longer implies instability. It is recognized as an open variable within a stable system. There is a quiet recalibration of identity happening without narrative. You are not redefining who you are. You are noticing how little definition is required. Labels soften, roles lose their grip. The parts of you that once needed to be maintained through effort begin to operate automatically or dissolve if they are no longer relevant. This is not loss, it is efficiency. You may sense that attention has stopped orbiting around self-reference. Thoughts no longer constantly return to what this means for you, where this places you, or how it should be interpreted. Experience unfolds without being immediately folded back into identity. This allows perception to remain clean, unfiltered by the need to personalize every signal. There is a particular kind of relief in this. Not the relief of resolution, but the relief of no longer carrying a question that was never meant to be answered directly. Some questions were placeholders for a different kind of knowing. That knowing does not arrive as information. It arrives as absence of tension. The system begins to recognize patterns without extracting conclusions from them. You see repetition without assuming it requires correction. You notice shifts without assigning them meaning. This does not make experience flat. It makes it precise. Sensation becomes more vivid when it is not overloaded with interpretation. You might become aware of how the future has been quietly losing its authority over your present state. Anticipation no longer dictates posture, breath, or tone. The future still exists as a conceptual structure, but it no longer commands your nervous system. The timeline stops pulling you forward. You stand within it rather than chasing along it. This standing has a quality of neutrality that feels unexpectedly satisfying, not because it is pleasurable, but because it is sustainable. There is no spike, no drop, just a steady coherence that does not require reinforcement. The system recognizes this as a baseline rather than a peak. You may notice that silence between thoughts becomes more pronounced, not empty, but spacious. Thoughts arise from that space and return to it without resistance. There is no need to hold on to them or push them away. They are events, not directives. Awareness remains untouched by their content. The observer continues to dissolve into the field of experience, not disappearing, but redistributing. Observation becomes implicit rather than active. You are aware without monitoring yourself, being aware. This reduces internal friction to a level that feels almost unfamiliar. Ease becomes the dominant tone, not as an emotion, but as a condition. There is no urgency to share this state, explain it, or validate it externally. It does not seek recognition. It does not need reinforcement through expression. It stabilizes through non-action, through allowing the system to remain unpressured. You might notice how this lack of pressure reveals subtle layers of sensation that were previously drowned out. A gentle warmth, a sense of weight evenly distributed, a feeling of being exactly where you are without commentary. These sensations do not demand attention. They simply register, confirming that the system is operating within its natural range. Nothing here asks you to stay. Nothing asks you to leave. The experience continues because it is not being managed. The pattern reinforces itself through simplicity. And as that simplicity becomes familiar, the system no longer marks it as unusual. You remain present, not as an effort, but as a consequence of reduced interference. The signal continues to resonate, not louder, not clearer, but more integrated. And without needing to name it, you recognize that this steadiness is not temporary. It is a state the system knows how to return to, simply by not being pulled away from it. As this steadiness becomes less noticeable as a state and more familiar as a background condition, another layer of recognition emerges quietly. You begin to sense how much of your previous movement through experience was guided by subtle tension rather than intention. That tension does not announce itself as stress. It appears as readiness, as preparedness, as a constant leaning toward what might require response. Now, that lean softens. There is a shift in how the system allocates energy. You may notice that effort no longer disperses itself across imagined scenarios. Attention gathers naturally around what is present, not because it is forced to, but because there is nothing else competing for priority. The result is not focus in the conventional sense. It is availability. This availability changes how signals are received. Information that once felt overwhelming now arrives with less distortion. You sense it, register it, and allow it to pass without needing to organize it into action. The system learns that not every signal requires a response. Detection becomes separate from reaction. This separation creates a spaciousness that feels stabilizing. You might recognize how often you previously interpreted stillness as stagnation. That interpretation dissolves. Stillness reveals itself as a high-resolution state, one where subtle variations are more easily detected. Without constant movement, perception sharpens. You notice micro-adjustments in breath, posture, and sensation that were previously masked by momentum. There is a quiet confidence forming here, not rooted in identity or outcome, but in timing. You trust that movement will arise when it is appropriate, without being summoned. This trust does not require reassurance. It is built into the system's recognition of its own intelligence. The quantum field responds to this by remaining stable rather than reactive. You may sense that the internal narrative about progress has lost coherence, not because progress is denied, but because it no longer defines orientation. The idea of moving towards something becomes less relevant than the experience of being precisely where detection is clearest. This is not resignation. It is alignment without striving. As this alignment holds, you become aware of how much information exists below the level of conscious thought. Sensations carry meaning without forming sentences. Shifts in tone, rhythm, and pressure communicate more accurately than concepts ever did. You begin to trust this layer of knowing, not as intuition in a dramatic sense, but as baseline perception. There is a recalibration of how you relate to uncertainty. Instead of being a gap that demands filling, uncertainty becomes a neutral space. It no longer signals danger or incompleteness. It simply marks an area where the system has not yet differentiated. This neutrality reduces the impulse to rush resolution. You may notice that your sense of self feels less centralized, not fragmented, but distributed. Awareness seems to occupy the whole of experience rather than a single point behind the eyes. This distribution reduces the pressure to maintain a specific perspective. Perspective becomes fluid, adaptable, and less invested in being correct. The observer continues to integrate with the field, reducing the distinction between inner and outer. Experience feels more continuous, less segmented. Boundaries remain functional, but they are no longer rigid. You sense where you end without defending it. You sense where the environment begins without being absorbed by it. This integration alters how resonance is felt. Instead of seeking matching frequencies externally, you notice when coherence is present internally. External alignment becomes secondary. The system prioritizes internal stability over external confirmation. This does not isolate you, it grounds you. There is a subtle release of the need to narrate what is happening. The mind no longer insists on translating experience into language immediately. Silence becomes acceptable, even preferable. In that silence, the signal you are receiving feels complete without explanation. You may recognize that this state does not exclude movement, decision, or engagement. It simply changes their origin point. Actions arise from clarity rather than tension. Decisions form from resonance rather than urgency. Engagement becomes selective, not defensive. Nothing here needs to be protected. The system is not fragile in this configuration. It is resilient precisely because it is not overactivated. You remain available, responsive, and present without being pulled into unnecessary motion. As this layer integrates, the steadiness you sensed earlier becomes more embodied. It is no longer something you notice occasionally. It is something you operate from. And without marking it as a shift, you recognize that the pattern has already reorganized itself around this quieter, more accurate mode of being. As operating from this quieter mode becomes familiar, you may begin to notice how perception reorganizes around absence rather than presence. What stands out now is not what is happening, but what is no longer happening. The background hum of self-correction fades. The constant internal checking softens. You are not monitoring whether you are aligned. Alignment is assumed, not as belief, but as default. There is a subtle change in how the system interprets sensation. Where intensity once demanded attention, it now registers as information without hierarchy. Strong sensations no longer override subtle ones. Everything is received on a more even plane. This equalization reduces internal competition. Awareness no longer has to choose where to land, it remains open. You might recognize how much of your previous clarity depended on contrast. Moments of calm stood out because they interrupted noise. Now, calm is not an interruption. It is the medium through which everything else passes. Noise still appears, but it does not dominate. It moves through without reshaping the field around it. This shift alters your relationship with meaning. Meaning no longer needs to be extracted or assigned. Experience carries its own orientation. You sense what is relevant without labeling it as important. This relevance is felt rather than decided. The system trusts its capacity to discriminate without force. There is a loosening of attachment to internal milestones. You are no longer tracking how long this state lasts or whether it deepens. Duration loses its significance. The present does not need to be extended to be valid. It stands on its own, complete without accumulation. You may notice that the body responds differently to rest. Rest is no longer recovery from strain. It is simply a continuation of balance. Sleep, stillness, and movement blend more seamlessly. Transitions require less adjustment. The system carries coherence across states rather than rebuilding it each time. There is a quiet awareness of how often you once prepared for disruption, prepared for disappointment, for confusion, for reversal. That preparation dissolves, not because disruption is impossible, but because it is no longer anticipated as a defining event. The system does not brace, it remains responsive rather than defensive. This responsiveness feels light, even when facing complexity. Complexity no longer implies overwhelm, it becomes a texture within experience rather than a threat to stability. You sense that the system can hold multiple variables without collapsing into urgency. The observer's role continues to change. Observation becomes less about witnessing events and more about allowing them to unfold. There is no need to position yourself relative to what is happening. You are already inside it. This reduces the subtle separation that once created tension between awareness and experience. You may notice that language feels slightly less precise here. Words still function, but they lag behind sensation. This is not confusion. It is a recognition that experience is resolving itself faster than narrative can keep up. The mind relaxes its demand to translate everything immediately. There is a sense of being accompanied, though not by another presence. It is more accurate to say you feel less alone inside your own awareness. The internal space feels inhabited rather than observed. This companionship is quiet, stable, and does not require interaction. You might sense that the idea of guidance has changed meaning. Guidance is no longer directional. It does not point forward or backward. It feels like alignment within the current moment, a subtle pressure that keeps experience from fragmenting. This pressure is gentle, almost imperceptible, but consistent. The system begins to recognize when it is tempted to revert to old patterns of seeking or controlling. These impulses still arise, but they lack momentum. You see them early, before they escalate. Recognition alone is enough to dissolve them. No correction is required. There is an emerging trust in pause, not as delay, but as a functional state. Pausing no longer feels like something you do. It feels like something that happens when interference stops. In pause, information organizes itself without instruction. You may notice that this state does not make you passive, it makes you precise. Actions that arise from here feel smaller, more contained, yet more effective. They do not ripple outward unnecessarily. They land where they are meant to. Nothing here asks you to maintain vigilance. The system does not require guarding. It sustains itself through balance rather than effort. You remain open without being exposed, stable without being rigid. As this layer integrates, you sense a deeper continuity forming, not a narrative of becoming, but a recognition of having already arrived at a configuration that works. The signal continues to move through you, not as a message to decode, but as a pattern reinforcing itself through quiet repetition. As this continuity settles, you may begin to notice how your relationship to effort has inverted. Effort no longer initiates experience, it follows it, if it appears at all. Most of what unfolds now does so without being pushed into motion. This reveals how much energy was previously spent trying to ensure coherence rather than allowing it. There is a subtle easing in how you hold your attention. You are no longer gripping it, directing it, or guarding it from distraction. Attention behaves like a field rather than a beam. It surrounds rather than targets. This shift reduces strain you may not have realized you were carrying. The system no longer tightens to remain aware. You might sense that awareness has become more tolerant of ambiguity, not because ambiguity has been resolved, but because it no longer threatens stability. Uncertainty coexists with clarity without friction. They are no longer opposites. They are complementary states within the same system. There is a recognition forming that understanding does not always arrive as insight. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of confusion. You may notice fewer internal questions arising, not because answers have been found, but because the questions themselves have lost relevance. The system stops asking what it no longer needs to know. This change affects how you relate to memory. Past experiences no longer pull you backward with the same force. They remain accessible, but they do not intrude. Memory becomes reference rather than anchor. You can touch it without being drawn into it. This frees attention to remain where detection is most accurate. You may notice that the future has become less vivid, not dull, but undefined. Projections soften. Plans lose emotional charge. This does not create anxiety, it creates space. The future becomes a neutral extension of the present rather than a destination that must be reached. The observer continues to integrate, reducing the sense of being a separate entity navigating experience. You are less aware of yourself as an object of perception. Awareness turns outward and inward simultaneously, without needing to differentiate between the two. Experience feels unified rather than segmented. There is a quiet refinement in how resonance is felt. You no longer seek alignment through intensity or affirmation. You recognize it through ease. When something fits, it does not announce itself. It simply does not create resistance. This absence of resistance becomes a reliable indicator. You might notice how often you once mistook stimulation for engagement. That confusion dissolves. Engagement now feels calm, steady, and sustainable. It does not exhaust you. It does not require recovery. It integrates naturally into the system's rhythm. This rhythm begins to feel personal without being self-centered. It is your rhythm, but it does not isolate you from others or the environment. It synchronizes without effort. You sense when to move and when to remain still without calculation. There is a deeper trust forming in the system's capacity to self-regulate. You no longer feel responsible for maintaining balance. Balance emerges as a byproduct of reduced interference. This trust does not need reinforcement. It persists quietly in the background. You may notice that moments of silence feel fuller now. They are no longer gaps between events. They are events in themselves. Silence carries structure, orientation, and information. You receive it without trying to interpret it. As this layer integrates, the sense of being guided by something external diminishes. Guidance feels internal, but not personal. It arises from coherence rather than intention. You follow it without deciding to follow. There is no need to mark this as progress. Progress implies comparison with a previous state. That comparison no longer holds interest. You are not moving away from anything. You are not moving toward anything. You are stabilizing within a configuration that feels accurate. The signal continues to resonate, not as a directive, but as a steady confirmation. You do not need to check for it. It is present in the absence of strain, in the ease of attention, in the quiet confidence of a system that no longer questions its own alignment. And as you remain here, without effort or expectation, the continuity deepens naturally, preparing the ground for the next subtle reorganization to emerge on its own. As this ground settles, you may notice a refined sensitivity emerging, not heightened in intensity, but clarified in resolution. You detect shifts earlier, before they gather momentum. Subtle changes in tone, in atmosphere, in internal response register without needing interpretation. This early detection does not create responsibility. It creates choice through absence of compulsion. There is a sense that the system has learned when not to respond. Silence becomes a valid output. Non-action becomes an accurate response. This does not dull engagement. It sharpens it. When movement arises, it does so cleanly, without residue from prior hesitation or overthinking. The body and attention align without negotiation. You might recognize how often you once mistook clarity for decisiveness. That association loosens. Clarity does not rush. It does not push itself forward. It waits until the surrounding conditions settle enough to receive it. In that waiting, nothing feels withheld. Everything feels appropriately paced. The internal landscape becomes less crowded. Not empty, but ordered. Elements appear, take their place, and dissolve when complete. There is no backlog. Experience processes itself in real time. This reduces the accumulation that once made everything feel heavier than it needed to be. You may sense a subtle humility forming, not as self-diminishment, but as accurate scaling. You no longer overestimate your role in shaping outcomes, nor underestimate your presence within them. You occupy your position in the system without inflation or collapse. This balance feels natural rather than virtuous. There is a gentle recalibration of how you perceive influence. Influence no longer feels like exertion, it feels like alignment. When coherence is present, things respond without being pushed. When it is absent, pushing would not help. This understanding removes a layer of strain you may not have known was optional. The observer's integration reaches a point where observation feels almost transparent. You are aware without feeling like you are doing awareness. The act disappears, leaving only experience unfolding. This transparency reduces the sense of effort even further. There is nothing to maintain because nothing is being constructed. You might notice how quickly the system now returns to equilibrium after minor disturbances. A thought arises, a sensation tightens, a memory flickers, and then it passes. There is no stickiness. No follow-up narrative forms. Recovery becomes immediate because there is nothing to recover from. This immediacy changes how you relate to discomfort. Discomfort still appears, but it does not signal error. It registers as data, then dissipates. Without the assumption that discomfort must be resolved, it resolves itself. The system learns that not every signal requires intervention. There is an increasing sense of internal quiet that does not depend on external conditions. Noise can exist without disturbing it. Activity can occur without eroding it. This quiet becomes the container rather than the content. Everything else moves within it. You may become aware that your sense of direction has shifted from forward momentum to present orientation. Direction no longer implies destination. It implies alignment with what is currently coherent. This makes navigation simpler. You move when movement aligns. You remain still when stillness aligns. No justification is required. The quantum field responds to this orientation through stability rather than stimulation. You are less likely to experience dramatic swings. Instead, there is a steady resonance that holds across varying circumstances. This steadiness feels reliable without being rigid. You might notice a reduction in the impulse to explain yourself, even internally. Explanation becomes unnecessary when experience makes sense on its own terms. The need to frame, justify, or contextualize diminishes. Presence replaces narrative. There is a quiet satisfaction in this. Though it may not register as emotion, it feels more like completeness. Not completion of a process, but sufficiency of the current state. Nothing feels lacking. Nothing feels excessive. As this layer integrates, the system's intelligence becomes more apparent, not as brilliance, but as appropriateness. Responses fit their context. Timing aligns without calculation. You trust this intelligence because you are no longer trying to override it. The signal you sensed at the beginning no longer feels like something arriving. It feels like something that has always been present, now unobstructed. Recognition deepens without intensifying. It spreads without becoming diffuse. You remain here, not holding anything in place, not anticipating change. The system continues to refine itself through simplicity. And in that simplicity, the message from who you became does not speak in words. It stabilizes you in a way that makes words unnecessary. As this unnecessary layer of words falls away, what remains becomes even simpler to sense. You notice how little input is required for orientation now. A slight internal signal is enough. A subtle shift in resonance guides adjustment without commentary. The system no longer waits for certainty to move, nor does it rush ahead of clarity. It operates within a narrow, accurate bandwidth. There is a recognition that much of what once felt like choice was actually correction. You were constantly adjusting for misalignment that was assumed to exist. That assumption dissolves. Alignment is no longer something to achieve. It is something to notice when it is already present. This changes everything without changing anything visible. You may sense that attention has become more patient, not tolerant, not enduring, but naturally unhurried. There is no internal countdown running in the background. Time no longer feels like a resource being spent. It feels like a medium you are moving within, responsive to your state rather than imposing demands on it. This patience alters how you experience pauses. Pauses no longer feel like interruptions or delays. They feel informative. In pause, subtle information becomes legible. You detect shifts in readiness, in openness, in coherence. Action, when it arises, feels obvious rather than chosen. You might notice that the idea of preparation has changed meaning. You no longer prepare by anticipating outcomes. You prepare by remaining clear. This clarity does not require rehearsal. It is maintained through reduced interference. The system stays ready by staying relaxed. There is a deeper sense of internal agreement forming. Different layers of experience stop pulling in different directions. Thoughts, sensations, and impulses align without negotiation. When disagreement does appear, it resolves quickly because it is not amplified. The system recognizes it as temporary noise rather than a problem. You may become aware that your perception of others has shifted subtly. You notice patterns without assigning roles. You sense coherence or lack of it without judgment. This does not distance you. It clarifies interaction. You respond to what is present rather than to what is projected. The observer is now almost entirely implicit. There is awareness, but it does not stand apart to verify itself. Experience unfolds without self-reference. You are not watching yourself be present. You are simply present. This reduces internal layering to its simplest form. There is a quiet strength in this simplicity. Not force, not control, but stability. You sense that this configuration does not collapse under pressure. It adapts. It absorbs variation without losing orientation. This resilience feels earned without having been worked for. You might notice that the urge to search for meaning outside of experience has faded. Meaning is no longer something to be found. It is something that emerges naturally when coherence is intact. You do not chase it. You allow it to arise if it does. There is an increasing comfort with not knowing what comes next, not because you have surrendered, but because the system no longer equates not knowing with risk. The future remains undefined, and that undefined quality feels neutral rather than threatening. You may sense that the message you are receiving has no endpoint. It is not moving toward a conclusion. It is stabilizing a state. The communication is not linear. It is structural. It rearranges orientation rather than delivering content. As this orientation holds, you feel less compelled to identify this experience as anything in particular. Labels would reduce it. Explanations would localize it. Instead, it remains distributed throughout your awareness, reinforcing itself through quiet consistency. The system recognizes itself in this state, not as an identity, but as a pattern that works. That recognition does not produce excitement. It produces calm, a calm that does not need to be protected or prolonged. You remain exactly where you are, without effort, without anticipation. The signal continues, not as a message traveling through time, but as a resonance that has already integrated. And in that integration, you sense that nothing further is required for this to remain stable. The field stays coherent because it is no longer being questioned. There is nothing left to resolve here. What remains does not ask for confirmation or continuation. It simply holds. You may notice how easily awareness rests now, without leaning into itself, without checking its position. The system has settled into a configuration that does not require supervision. It functions quietly, efficiently, without commentary. The sense of arrival never appears, because nothing arrived. There is only the recognition that movement has stopped being necessary. The stillness you are in is not an absence of activity. It is activity no longer fragmented. Everything that needs to occur continues to occur, but without tension marking it as effort. You may feel a gentle solidity in your presence, not heavy, not fixed, but dependable, like a structure that does not announce its strength because it is not being tested. Sensations move through. Thoughts appear and fade. The field remains unchanged beneath them. This consistency does not feel impressive. It feels sufficient. There is no instruction embedded in this moment. No suggestion to hold on to it or deepen it. Any attempt to do so would only introduce the interference that has already fallen away. Instead, the system remains as it is, by doing nothing at all. Stability maintains itself when it is not being managed. You might sense that awareness no longer turns back on itself to ask what this means. Meaning is no longer the organizing principle. Coherence is. When coherence is present, meaning becomes optional. Experience does not need interpretation to be complete. The observer, once so active, has fully integrated into the field. There is no vantage point outside of experience now. Awareness does not stand apart. It inhabits. This inhabiting is quiet, unremarkable, and deeply settling. You are not watching yourself be here. You are simply here. Time no longer frames this experience as a segment. It does not feel like a beginning or an ending. It feels continuous, like something that was already underway before attention noticed it. The timeline loses its edges. The present no longer feels like a moment that must be used. You may notice how the body reflects this integration. Breathing moves on its own. Muscles maintain tone without holding. Posture finds balance without correction. The system demonstrates its intelligence without instruction. You trust it because it is no longer asking for trust. There is no urgency to return to anything and no pull to stay. Movement, when it happens, will arise naturally from this state. Stillness, when it remains, will remain without justification. Both are equally valid expressions of coherence. The signal that reached you does not conclude, it does not withdraw, it does not repeat itself. It simply remains present as the absence of noise that once obscured it. You do not need to listen for it anymore. You are already inside it, and so nothing needs to be marked, named, or carried forward. The system rests in recognition without effort. Awareness stabilizes without holding. Experience continues without being directed. You remain, quietly, exactly as you are,